Good afternoon, everyone. It's my privilege to welcome you all to this special conversation with our distinguished guest, former United States Ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Samantha Power. And Ambassador Power, it's an honor to welcome you back to Georgetown to discuss your latest book, The Education of an Idealist. We were honored that just this past February, you joined our student-led Own It Summit, and it's wonderful to have you back again. I'd also like to share a special word of appreciation to Paul Eli, Senior Fellow at our Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And we're grateful to Paul, who will moderate our conversation, and to our co-sponsors of our event, the Berkeley Center, the Institute of Politics and Public Service at our McCourt School of Public Policy, and our Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. Throughout her career, Ambassador Power has been deeply committed to public service and to sharing its importance through her writing, providing important insights on issues of human rights and matters of peace and security around the world. In her early days of her career as a journalist, she helped to document and illuminate the tragedies of global conflict and human suffering from her reporting in places such as Bosnia during the Bosnian War. In her first book in 2002, A Problem from Hell, she focused on the devastating consequences of genocide and the complexities of the US response over the past century. She was awarded a Pulitzer Prize and a National Book Critics Circle Award. Her 2008 New York Times bestseller, Chasing the Flame, One Man's Fight to Save the World, capturing the life of Sergio Vieira de Mello. That book became the inspiration for the film Sergio, a Netflix adaptation of the book, which was released earlier this year. Ambassador Power's insights have also been featured in her writing as a contributor to The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and the New York Review of Books. She brought her special focus and commitment to the protection of human rights to her work in the Obama administration, first as Senior Director for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights at the National Security Council, and then from 2013 to 2017 as the US Ambassador to the United Nations, the youngest person ever to assume this role. Through her memoir, The Education of an Idealist, we learn about some of the pressing questions that confronted US foreign policy during these years of Ambassador Power's service, with her perspectives on a number of complex challenges, such as how to respond to the use of chemical weapons in Syria. We also benefit from her reflections on her personal journey, on some of the defining experiences that have shaped her leadership on the global stage. Ambassador Power has twice been named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people. She was the founding executive director of the Carr Center for Human Rights at the Harvard Kennedy School, and she continues her service as a professor at Harvard in both the Kennedy School and at Harvard Law School. I wish to again express our gratitude to Ambassador Power for being with us today and for her extraordinary example of leadership in public service. And again, to help our conversation with Ambassador Power, we're pleased to have Paul Eli, whose writing has also appeared in national publications such as The Atlantic, the New York Times Magazine, Vanity Fair, and is a regular contributor to The New Yorker. Paul has published some wonderful work, including his 2003 and 2012 books, The Life You Save May Be Your Own and Reinventing Bach, both recognized as finalists for the National Book Critics Circle Award. So I wish to thank everyone who is joining us for this live conversation, and it's now my pleasure to turn this over to Paul Eli and Ambassador Power.
Thank you very much, President DeGioia, and thank you to our co-sponsors, whom President DeGioia already named, and also to the students in Marilyn McMorrow's seminar in the School of Foreign Service who have read this book, and the students in my Ignatius seminar called The Search, who devoted 2 different weekly seminars to the reading and consideration of The Education of an Idealist. webinar is being recorded, and we'll post the recording to the event page on the Berkeley Center site soon. And if you registered for the event today, you'll get an email with a link to the video when it becomes available. Last part of the session, last 15 to 20 minutes, we'll answer questions from the audience. Submit your question, use the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen and type it in. And if you're joining via the live streams, email questions to berkeleycenter@georgetown.edu and put your name and affiliation if you can. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. Thank you especially to Ambassador Samantha Power for accepting this invitation and making time in what's got to be a very busy schedule for talking about this book, which has meant so much to us.
Thank you. I'm so delighted to be here. You don't know. So thank you.
I feel we're in an auspicious moment, one that President-elect Biden has made a moment under the sign of Seamus Heaney through his constant invocation of that passage from the Cure at Troy. In this moment, almost a little less than 4 years ago, you left the government as the administration's changed. In that time, you wrote a book, really a double book, 2 books in one, had it published, lauded, read, you've spoken about it, and now presumably here you are ready to go again in government. How are you identified inwardly at this moment? Do you think of yourself as a writer, a policymaker, a diplomat, or is that not a useful distinction?
I guess, well, first of all, thank you for doing this. And, I've been privileged since I left government to engage with students a fair amount, but I don't know that I've ever engaged with a student body where I know at least some studious subset has actually read the book. And I can already tell from the questions in the chat, that's informing what they're bringing to the conversation, nor have I, Paul, focused on process all that much and the writing. It's a book and a set of reflections that are where people want to go right to the policy area they're concerned about, or right to the life story and the work-life balance. But to actually talk about the writing is kind of thrilling for me, actually, and very unusual. So in terms of how I feel now, I mean, maybe the first thing that comes to mind, I suppose, is as a parent, feeling that, and just, confessing my political preferences. I was rooting for Biden. I worked for the Biden campaign to do fundraisers and do outreach to various constituencies. And this weekend, to sit with my kids and watch the acceptance speech for Vice President-elect Harris and President-elect Biden, and to not have to worry about covering the ears of my kids or shooing them out of the room, or, I mean, in a way, it's just, I didn't even realize kind of those small reflexive concerns that one is having at all times in light of the kind of leadership, in quotes, that we've been getting in a range of areas. And so just to have both my kids absorbing a message that reached out to people with disabilities, to people of color, to immigrants this country, of whom I'm one, to call for unity and healing. And you just realize how exhausted you are, having woken up every day for 4 years and feared that something sad was going to happen in a given day. And obviously we're not out of the woods yet. And this is a very sad period in some ways, combining the joy of seeing, bottom-up democracy actually work, the joy and relief of seeing many of our institutions hold, but also being reminded every day about how vulnerable we are. And so that's also really hard to talk to your kids about. It's really hard to sort of give them the perspective that this isn't normal, and nor should they view it as normal. At the same time, a full 50% of my daughter's life has been lived with breaches from protocols that presidents of both parties have observed for a long time. So that's mainly it, is just that kind of happiness and relief, combined with a sense of foreboding about what this portends regarding our divisions, especially as a country, which I know is of deep concern to many who are watching tonight.
I know, reading the book, I read it in page proofs before it was published, and then again this summer, and to read especially the passages where you describe the attention that you and everybody in the group was giving to the briefing books and to the multiple redactions of speeches, and to feel that we were seeing that not happening in the government before our eyes, and to feel a kind of pain at the gap between the care that was taken by you and your colleagues, and the evident lack of care that was being taken by some others in the present moment. So we could really feel the difference, and I'm looking forward to watching an administration where everybody reads the briefing book again.
No, indeed. I mean, what I try to show in the book, right, is that I did want to show the integrity of the effort, and you can take issue with the results and even take issue with the choices or the policy prioritization. There's a lot to people can have different views on, but I think when you think about young people like the students watching tonight, there just aren't that many vehicles for getting under the hood and really knowing what that process is like, the frustrations of it, pressing your face up against the glass and trying to be a part of a process that you're not welcome to contribute to, maybe being shot down even by the big boss, occasionally not so much fun. But then when it works and when it feels as if people are rowing in the same direction, and the kind of integrity of it, the ethics of it back in the day, I really did intend the book to inspire people to think that they'd want to be a part of something like that. It's also kind of, I come from a sports background, as you know, from reading the book and watching sports and playing every sport I could. And very much that team spirit that pervaded the government. Again, not on bad days, just like on sports teams, you could waver from team goals, and certainly there are a lot of egos in place, including my own, I'm sure. But that, again, that the idea that there's a team that you can join that's really motivated by reasonable differences about how to try to improve lives, right? I mean, that's basically what it was about. And even if we fail to improve lives, if the reasonable differences meant that one's own view about how it should be done is rejected over some other view, or if whose lives you're talking about, that can dictate how to spend scarce resources, because you have finite bandwidth and finite resources. But for young people to see what it's like, and the humor and the camaraderie and the tension and the suspense, and I think more exposure would actually make more, not fewer, people want to be part of that enterprise. That was at least my working theory going in.
I think it worked. We, in the class, we savored the jargon sections where you explained about the deliverables and the action forcing events and showing some leg and all this stuff.
Half pregnant when you're actually half pregnant, as I was half pregnant. Yes. I mean, I was fully pregnant, but I was at half term. Yes.
We began the course with Dreams from My Father, and I was reading David Remnick's book about the rise of Obama as supplementary reading. I wound up getting totally engrossed. And at one point, Valerie Jarrett kind of suggests, well, Barack's so talented, he needs a real challenge. And he really hadn't had a challenge since he wrote Dreams from My Father, so he had to run for president, which I liked, the thought that writing a literary book is a challenge up there with running the country. Is that the way, do they feel comparable to you?
No, but maybe just to say a word about Barack Obama, who has a book coming out in the next week that is a masterpiece, a triumph, in terms of weighting, I think, deep questions about human nature. I mean, it's not your average political memoir, I can tell you that. But I do think in Barack Obama, you have somebody who, brings that meticulousness, fastidiousness, and kind of literary sensibility, which includes a fair amount of, doubt and searching, to what he did in the White House, what he did as a senator, what he did as a community organizer, and to what he does as a writer. And I think that's what made him a very empathetic leader, even if he doesn't emote in the way that, let's say, President-elect Biden emotes. I can tell you on, the wrenching issues like Syria, just, the image of him as Spock was completely belied by, what he was actually going through as he grappled with these really, again, tough questions about how to deploy American power, and especially at a time when our country was reeling and exhausted. But the idea that, I didn't know that Valerie quote, but I having sort of been with him when he did Audacity of Hope, when I was working in his Senate office at that time, and read his chapters in draft and offered comments, and having done a bit of the same on the recent book, or on the forthcoming book, he's just all in whatever he's doing, and there's no mailing it in for Barack Obama. And I think the best writing in the world reflects the same spirit, like never satisfied, just going over and over and over. And not just in his case, he's got to get all the facts right because of all the people, of course, who may be on the other side of the political spectrum who would like nothing more than to pick it apart on those grounds. He's got to make the case for the things he still believes are the right things to do, but then he wants it to read like a novel, and I think a lot of people who write political memoirs don't have that aspiration, don't think so much about building out character and making the reader come and walk. How could you even imagine as a reader walking in the shoes of the president? Well, I think that's what just as when he was younger and he wrote Dreams of My Father, he wanted you to walk in his shoes as a person struggling for his identity. His ambition, I don't think changed. If anything, of course, it's greater for a lot of other reasons, but his literary ambition, remains really demanding, very, very demanding of himself and of what's on the page. So I think it shows in the final product, but you all will be the judge.
Mine's pre-ordered from Seminary Co-op in Chicago. I can't wait to get it.
Nice.
The way you articulated all that suggests how much thought you've put into it yourself. So on one level, I characterize the book to my students as a search for meaningful action, do something. What does it mean to do something at different stages of your life? But from a point of view of composition or as a piece of writing, you've got so many different things going on: a family story, a woman's coming of age story, the story of a war correspondent, how stuff works, kind of the way you suggested, put you in the shoes of a person working in the administration. How deliberately do you have to think about all those different aspects and how they're going to converge in a single work?
Well, I'll give you more insight into my process than you may have ever wished, or maybe
Please.
some subset of the audience ever wished. So I offer it in two parts. First of all, when I began writing this book, my going in assumption, in keeping with my response to the prior question about Obama, is that nobody cares about me, they care about Barack Obama. So I think that was a pretty fair going in assumption. And so I thought, look, if I'm going to write something that is a memoir, which is still, I struggle to get out of my mouth the idea that I've written a memoir. And I've said, you may have heard me say elsewhere, but just that Irish people have trouble using the first person, even in therapy. And so to get over that threshold, to write a memoir, maybe one way I justified it to myself was, I'll be offering, yes, this hopefully implicit defense of public service at a time when public service and the so-called deep state is being attacked, implicit summons to engagement and to try to do good in the world. As it happens, my story takes place in the foreign policy space, but I think the lessons apply in local ways as well, and in terms of family and friends and so forth. So I wanted to convey that spirit. But I thought my vehicle for that will be principally the Obama years. And so this is sort of part one of my process, was really delving into that. Now, there's still a huge number of decisions of inclusion and exclusion, which episodes in that 8-year period are going to do the work that I want to do in terms of particularly the young people who I hope will read the book. That's my mindset at the time. So I make some of those decisions of inclusion and exclusion, and I go back to my journals and my memories. I talk to colleagues, friends, and so forth from that period, including Cass Sunstein, who I met on the Obama campaign, my husband, who's also a writer, although of a very different kind. And so I sort of piece it together, and I tend to put words on the page and write my way to sorting out what my narrative arc is, rather than knowing precisely what my narrative arc is in advance. So, but I knew I had some core first order choices about what would go in and what would go out that would be themselves hard to make, and that I needed to write it out to see what would be funny, what would be gripping, what would be make you cry. Like, I needed to see if I could execute those episodes. So I did all that, and I had some stuff. And then I realized nobody cares about the character Samantha Power, because by and large, like, I had compressed my prior life, into what came before. I had imagined doing that. And to really root for a character or to walk in a character's shoes, you have to know where they come from and why they believe what they believe. When I'm losing an argument to, let's say, bring Iraqi interpreters to this country because they're being targeted for having helped US forces in the war in Iraq, I can write about that. And that's intrinsically moving. As a journalist, I would have written about that and probably could have made it pretty moving. But when I lose and when I fail as an actor in a system, let's say, and I ultimately did succeed working with others and because of President Obama's commitment on that issue, but let's say in the early days in the trials and travails, why would a reader care about my arc or my growth or my learning if they don't know what came before and where that kind of dough was needed or where those impulses came from? And so that was a really big moment for me of, wow, I need to actually build out the character who sadly happens to be me. And so I
get over that scruple about writing a memoir.
Yeah, well, I had to get over that. Well, I'd already gotten over it to write, but I was going to be a political memoir, right? It was going to be, and then I'd have all the who I am kind of compressed. But you can't do that because the reader, if you want the reader to root for you on one level, or even get mad at you for betraying what you articulate as your own principles, they have to know you in some deeper sense. And so that was part one of, and that then led to a whole scavenger hunt, into my own past and to try to make meaning of things that I'd kind of conveniently run away from, some of them. And it also gave me an excuse to be a reporter, as I once was, into my own past and to ask questions that as a daughter or a niece, my dad died, was one of the stories I tell in a very painful way. I had avoided those questions because I didn't want to upset my mother or my aunt, my dad's sister. And suddenly here I am, and there's a set of questions that I should have asked years ago and should have put my own need to know ahead of that, but I didn't. And this book and going back and doing that sort of precursor to whenever whenever Obama enters the picture, it gave me sort of the excuse I guess I needed, or the prompt to go back and dig deep. So that's part one. Part two, more in brief, is even once I had done that, and I felt like I was pretty clear on my own education, I had, and I always write long, I had a very long manuscript, let's say a couple hundred pages, probably longer than the long manuscript that was published. And then I just, in a sense, became reporter or professor to my own story and tried to look at it and say, okay, what are the different strands? What are the different arcs? Because there's the kind of conventional arc of what do you think America's role in the world should be, or where does human rights fit into everything? That's what people would expect from a book like that. But like you said, there's all these other arcs, like how I relate to my personal life or to men or let's say then when it gives way after Cass enters the scene, to my kids, and whether I'm making space for that against the backdrop of a kind of frenetic professional life. There's questions of faith and religion that kind of run through it. I read Andre Agassi's amazing memoir, Open, which I recommend to everyone, even if you don't like tennis or no interest in reading a sports memoir, because what I realized in reading that was something about my own life, which is often, especially coming just with my mother and my younger brother to America, you're kind of alone. We were a small unit, and part of what my life has been about is about, kind of pulling this person into my life and this mentor into my life and sort of building out this extended family of people I met along the way. And I don't know that I would have even noticed that that's what I have done had I not read Agassi's own arc of kind of building family and plucking and so forth. So I realized that tale of extended family building and solidarity was another tale. And then my arc as a feminist and as a woman and becoming over time more self-conscious. So there were all of these arcs, and I just literally took a big piece of paper and kind of wrote, as I went through it, I was like, okay, woman, but men/kids, foreign policy, America's place in the world, and I just went through and then drew arcs and looked at where the key moments were, where some learning had occurred or some epiphany or revelation. And then I went back and cut with those arcs in mind to try to build out, to never to want it to be heavy handed. So it would be subtle, but nonetheless, as you know, if there's too much excess, if there's diversion from some of that, those would get more buried and would be less likely to if not be, again, I'm not explicit about any of that in the book, but you'd be less likely to get that impression of growth and development if you keep the excess in there. So those are the sort of two big process points, I guess, takeaways for me and this writing process, which was so different from others that I've been involved in.
It's really enlightening because when I taught the book, we took a month between part 1 and part 2, and I posed via, an electronic question to the students. Would part 1 be a book into itself without part 2? Would part 2 be a book unto itself without part 1? You got resounding yeses for the, integrity of each section on its own. But then we talked about how they fit together. I used the image of breaking waves, and you used the image of arcs, but something similar there. I talked about the book as a search, and the distinction that I often make is, to what extent is the search happening in the life you're leading that's later described, and to what extent is the search happening on the page, the writer figuring stuff out as she organizes it and rearranges it? So you learn things about yourself and your life and your motives in the act of writing?
Yes, I mean, in general, I do feel like my fingers are kind of thought vehicles. In general, I sort through writing. I mean, whether through journal writing or my best friend John Prendergast and I, since I left government, we write to each other at the end of the day and share the 3 things during the day for which we're grateful. And that is a way of making meaning out of the day. So in that sense, even in these more basic ways, I think writing has been just always a way I've sorted things through. But here, the bigger question animating the book is, what would today's Samantha Power tell the old Samantha Power? What does the new Samantha Power say to the old Samantha Power? All the question of activist to government official, that required the kind of reflection that a life in national security and, in the cabinet of the President of the United States just didn't afford me with the ability to be living above myself, in order to know what the answers to those questions were at the time.
I mean, you had to be immersed in it in order to do the job right.
I think so. I mean, and certainly if I had a comparative advantage as a White House staffer or as a diplomat, it was, complete relentless, it was just a refusal to give up and like being as immersed, there was nothing light about my attachment to the things that I was pushing. It doesn't mean I succeeded, but to the degree that I ever succeeded, it was because I wouldn't give up. And so I went meta on myself more than maybe some of my colleagues or more than I think non-writers might do, insofar as I for example, I write in the book about people calling for me to resign over Syria and so forth. So, I did want to discipline myself and actually grapple with criticisms of the way that I was doing my job or criticisms of me as a person. So I did try to step out of the role to grapple with questions like that. But that's quite different, like the calculus of do you stay or do you go, or why do you stay or why do you go, and is really different than how have you grown and what have you learned. And for example, one of the things that snuck up on me that these were words that came out of my mouth even when I was in the job, but I wouldn't have seen it as just such a recurrent and important part of my life, is where I take the Sheryl Sandberg lean in idea and then alter it in the chapter called Lean On. And, it was only in going back over my life, and any of us would do this, right? It's such an obvious feature of life where just at every hard time you're leaning on someone. But only in going back through do you really start to sort of appreciate and cherish and then looking forward, covet those connections where there are just so many people in your life who have your back. And that gets back to the Agassi point of sort of building extended family as you go. And so, for example, when I was at the White House and there were some not ideal gender dynamics, and where we women were very outnumbered, and the national security community, of course, is famously guys. And at the time, I really appreciated the fact that one of my female colleagues convened the female senior directors, the sort of core staff to President Obama, for a glass of wine and to talk about our weeks and our days and talk about our kids and our marriages and our romances or whatever. I appreciated it at the time, but it was only when I went back and wrote about it that I really saw the connection between that, which became known as the Wednesday group, because we knew we needed it so badly after one glass of wine that not the wine, although maybe that too, but the company and the solidarity, that we began doing it every Wednesday. So I knew I was grateful to my colleague for coming up with this idea. I knew that it was an incredibly cathartic and commiserative at times exercise, but I hadn't seen the connection between that and then me becoming UN ambassador and convening all the female ambassadors in the so-called G37, Girl 37. There are 193 countries, 37 female ambassadors. So we also, their women were feeling outnumbered. It's a very male-dominated organization, institution. And crazy, right? Like, of course it was of a piece with what had happened at the White House, but it was only in writing it that I saw that some of what just feel like reflexes in the moment actually have this lineage, and where that's about learning about what you need to build coalitions and to sometimes just to get through the day.
I guess hearing you say that, I get the sense then that the book becomes the Wednesday night group on a very large scale that use various techniques to bring a very large number of women into the group and feel joined to you. Some of them have to do with vulnerability. I mean, did you ever have to think, well, I'd better not put myself crying in the office in the book, I might not get the next job? Or do you just fearlessly plow ahead and tell it the way it is?
No, I mean, there's where the literary, and again, I even using that phrase sounds a little bit.
Please do. It's a literary book.
But well, thank you. Probably better you say that than me. But I mean, it certainly aspires to be, and I think so. There are two reasons that you, if you're me, might ration how many times you're crying in the book. One is your point, the voice in your head that says, geez, like maybe one day I want to go work in government again. Is someone going to want to hire a crying person? To be honest, I didn't really think about that so much. Others did who read the book. It's like, just, dial it back. Like, we don't need, TMI, and these are just select moments. But the literary, again, to use that phrase, the person who's really thinking about, a fast moving narrative about these arcs and wanting them not to be heavy-handed or explicit, but also for them to be felt, realize that, it's also like my romantic difficulties as well, which are in the book. Sometimes you just need illustrative examples. You don't need to hear about every bad choice I made in my cast life. But if I give you a couple choice examples, like you get the full picture, right? The part can, if done well, it can stand for the whole. And the same was true, I think, in vulnerability, frankly, is that I absolutely felt that, and actually I should have said this earlier, in the spirit of wanting young people to read the book, they weren't going to be able to relate to necessarily or terribly well to that White House official. If I start the book, the narrative thrust, right when I meet Obama, let's say, or so an official in his Senate office. Whereas, just because they might say, well, I'll never be in that job, or I'm not even interested in going into foreign policy. Whereas by starting in my childhood and covering so many different dimensions of a young person's life, I'm creating a lot more points of entry potentially for readers, right? And in writing about vulnerability, especially, I hope I've created more points of entry to what from the outside looks like a very polished life, right? I mean, the number of people who I know and I'm even close to who said, I didn't know that you had these horrible anxiety issues, and I knew about your bad romantic choices. I didn't know that you couldn't breathe, like, why didn't you tell me, and just because, and that's life, right? Is so many people just motoring ahead, and they become the sum of their CVs, the sum of their resumes, rather than the sort of internal churn and dynamics that are coexisting, maybe even with professional achievement. And so I thought, by opening up the churn and the vulnerability and the foibles, that, people, I think more people live in that space than live in the, I'm going to be a cabinet member of the president of the United States. I thought it was important, but then if you overdo it, then it's a pity party, or it's lugubrious, or it's, it's got it can feel also like memoir 101. I was sort of guarding against, let me guess, there's an origin story, right? Like, I wanted it to feel, just as spare. It had to have enough detail to bring people in and for them to feel those points of entry and points of connection, but not so much that it felt self-indulgent, that I was writing my way, that I was having my own catharsis on the page, and that I wasn't all that sensitive to what readers needed. And so that balance, I thought, was important to try to strike.
I think it worked really, really well. And I was thinking about it, just hearing you talk, in terms of fear, and how there's that memorable episode in the book where a friend of yours is trying to get you to go into therapy, and he says, "Come on, you lived in a war zone. Why can't you talk about yourself? Why can't you do this?" And then that, to me, relates to the experience you had with A Problem from Hell. You made enough bold statements in that book for the Ted Cruzes of the world to hammer at you in congressional hearings for the rest of your life. So what have you got to be afraid of? You've already done it. You've lived in the war zone. You've written a book where you took a really strong position, and you're here to tell the tale.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would distinguish your prior question from that question, because, or from at least the predicate of that question, because I do think writing about one's sort of innards and one's vulnerabilities and one's anxiety and therapy and demons did feel different to me. It did feel like entering, a potentially more perilous domain. I mean, both as a writer, just how to get that voice right in and not feel self-indulgent, or not be creating artificial causality between that and something, and so there's that just, it was a new domain that felt, sort of different, just like a different voice to try to master than the question of whether you state your political preferences or your foreign policy preferences, and whether you're likely to be picked apart or not get another job. Or again, I wasn't really so focused on the latter. I mean, maybe in some ways polarization is it may be the case that fewer people think that way now because it's so sad, but just by being a Democrat, so many people are making up what you didn't write. They're deep fakes. It's like, you might as well, I mean, Cass is always saying this to me in a different context, which is, he uses the expression, "therein madness lies." Like, if you're to try to game out today what a particular senator is going to take issue with in your writing or in your tweets or in your public commentary, therein madness lies, because your mere existence as a Democrat for some is enough to be disqualifying, right? Your belief that we should stay in NATO, for Donald Trump may be disqualifying. I mean, so unfortunately with polarization, it's just the what are becoming, this is less true in foreign policy, but certainly on the domestic front, the issues that divide us, substance alone is enough to cause people to question, whether you should serve, rather than some, particularly strongly worded claim as it relates to this direction or that direction. I may be wrong, and I may come to regret, things I've written, but the other vulnerabilities felt certainly they were more on my mind, the personal vulnerabilities of putting that out there and how would that come across, and all things considered, is it the right thing also to do for my family? I was thinking about my kids reading the book one day, and what of that do I want them to read? I mean, it's just talk about dual audiences or multiple audiences. There's a lot going on in your mind when you're thinking about putting something permanent out into the world.
I want to go to the audience questions soon. They're piling up in the Q&A, and we have some people on tap already. But there's a couple of things that maybe I'll kind of put them out before you together. One is, I know there's a paperback edition coming out, and what it is that you did in framing the paperback edition in an afterword or whatever. And the other is just how uncanny it was to read the chapter about Ebola in your book. It was written and probably discussed on your book tour before any of this pandemic happened. But to read your chapter is to read what we're going through now happening on a smaller scale, and the issues of bending the curve and isolation and so forth. It's really uncanny, and you can't have imagined it. But how does this moment strike you as someone who took such a role in the Ebola response to Ebola?
Well, your two questions are, maybe you anticipated this, but they're directly related to one another, because I'm not somebody who has written sort of new afterwords or forewords for prior hardcover books when they come out in paperback. I'm kind of, once I'm done with a book, I'm done with a book, and I let it go live in the world. And yes, I'll tour the paperback, I hope, but to go back in and to try to get back in that headspace of being in memoir mode rather than get Joe Biden elected mode, which is the mode I've been in, in the last months. That wasn't something I took on lightly, and I felt like I had the right ending for my reader. I felt I had summed up kind of what I had learned in just the way I wanted to, and my ambition in the original afterword was to make it timeless. Inevitably, I of course had to talk about Trump to an extent, but by and large, I tried to make larger points about what I had learned, in the spirit again of seeking to inspire people to try to make a difference in whatever world they're in. But anyway, because of the pandemic and the Ebola chapter, I decided to you could call it update the afterword, but basically go back into the afterword and rewrite it for now. So it has some of the afterword coming out in the paperback, has some of the same updating on my life, some of the same sort of forward-looking attempts at inspiration, rooted in the experience that people would have just read about in the book. But it goes much deeper into what we can mine from what people will have read in the book for right now and going forward. So for a pandemic world, yes, but also a post-pandemic world, which is the world we'll be living in for many years to come. So that's part of the framing, is really being, even though I was ambassador to the UN, I go light in the book on making the case for the liberal international order, like, God forbid. That's not the point of the book. But with the pandemic and walking away from the World Health Organization and walking away from science, it is important, I think, to draw these distinctions and to show that from the Ebola case, that's how the system it was meant to work when it was first created back in 1945, the UN system, and that when it works, that's the only way it works, namely with a catalytic actor like the United States stepping forward, being the first mover, not being the world's policeman, but leveraging the commitments that the United States makes then to get other countries to chip in, to get Cuba to send doctors, to get East Timorese people to send little SIM cards that will go and help contact tracing, to get China to build Ebola treatment units of their own, to get the UK to take the lead in Sierra Leone while we take the lead in Liberia. And so this notion, which has become now more prevalent because of Trump's propagation of it, that our fates are somehow not connected to those of people living overseas, is just false. And the pandemic, if you needed a reminder of that, the pandemic is Exhibit A, but Ebola was a precursor to that and to those splits. The other dimension of Ebola that I think bears notice, or the Ebola experience that bears notice today, and that I touch on in the new afterword, is fear and just the potency of fear in our politics. And I think that that is something we saw Donald Trump try that in the midterm with the fears of the caravans, and certainly, bringing it to bear in this election about law and order and the suburbs, they're going to destroy the suburbs and this and that. But one of the things that I grapple with a little bit in the afterward is, for as much as I can critique Donald Trump for doing that and lament, that tendency on his part, or that practice on his part, being on the other side and preaching hope and unity and decency and facts, and not hyping things that aren't true in order to generate this fear. Once the fear genie is out of the bottle, it's really actually hard to meet people where they are when they're afraid. And I think it'll be interesting to dig into the results of the election and know the extent to which the president-elect actually succeeded in doing that, or the extent to which just partyism was such that it was all about turnout, on either side. But we've got to figure out how to deal with fear in our politics, and not blow past it and say, oh, it's irrational or it's this, but somehow reach people who are living in more and more insulated spaces. And then the last thing I'd say, Paul, if I may, I know we're about to do questions, but the other things that have happened since I sort of closed the afterword for the hardcover is that while I think some of our institutions have proven very, very vulnerable, the people power, whether it's Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement, which had, of course, happened before I wrote the hardcover of the book, or the students who are active now in the climate change space or on the gun control space. I mean, this is how America changes when we change, right? It's pretty rare in our history. There are occasions, right, where it's like top down. Here's this great progressive thing we're going to do. Here's this great reformist cause I want you Americans to climb on board with. But by and large, like, change is claimed. And so I wanted to get at that because, again, I don't expect the readers of my book to be people who care about foreign policy as such. But if they care about change, I think there's a real lesson in that citizenship as this potent tool, and the best answer to the question that I posed, which everyone is asking, are we going to be okay? Well, answer: how many people turned out to vote? How many young people bring up their registration numbers and then follow through and vote themselves? Did those of us who wanted Biden to win, do round after round of get out the vote or raise money, or those sort of expressions of commitment around a different platform than one predicated on fear, that's where the change is going to come out. Yes, we have a vehicle now in the new president-elect for sure, and now it's he'll have to make a set of choices. But our responsibility as citizens, those responsibilities don't end because someone's in charge who we think is going to be a vehicle for the things we care about. Like, that's the lesson, really, is that we have to keep the drumbeat up in a bottom-up way.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. I'm looking at my notes, and a word from your Ebola chapter is interdependence. And I think just to knit a few things together, to go through a pandemic is to realize human interdependence. To work for universal human rights is to realize human interdependence. My problem is your problem. My success is your success. And let's hope we're not all fearful together, and that we can move to a different place together. Thank you so much. I'm going to go to the questions now, just in case I don't get to kind of round out things at the end. This has been so rich, and I'm so grateful for the way you're extending yourself with these answers and really going deep and trying to figure out what you did with this book. You really have done something. The first couple of questions are going to be from students in my class, I think. Nicolette Carrion will be the first person to post a question. She should come on screen any moment if she's not here already.
Hi, thank you so much. It's honestly amazing just to hear from you. I'm really excited. My name is Nicolette, obviously, and I am a first year, so class of 2024, and I'm in Georgetown College. And my question was to you first, like I found it striking how in a memoir about a high-ranking U.S. official, how honest you were, and like you showed a lot of humility. Like you were honest about like the failures or like the struggles, and it wasn't always perfect, and it wasn't like you were able to get everything done that you wanted to. So I wanted to know, how important was that for you to convey that, and why did you want to convey that? And just sorry, just this what I want to add was just like I really loved your piece on feminism as well, and I wanted to know like the importance of that with Kamala Harris and everything going on. Thank you.
That's great. You broke up just a little bit on the feminism. Is that what you asked about feminism and reflections on that? Is that what you said in the second part of it?
Yeah, that was like the second half I talked about.
Okay, got it. I heard the first part. You just broke up for just a second.
Sorry,
Thank
my
you.
connection was bad.
No, it's okay, Nicolette. Thank you. So you know, we have a saying. I swear a lot. Unfortunately, not as much in the book. That's another example, Paul, of the stuff that came out. Maybe that's part 3 of, you know, it's not just how much crying or how much vulnerability, but you know, how many expletives can you have in a memoir and still claim that you're appealing to young people. But so because I have this bad habit, which I'm working on, but you know, I'll say to my children who are now Declan and Rian, who you read about in the book, Nicolette, but Declan's 11 and Rian is 8, if you can believe it already. But you know, if I accidentally let loose some kind of swear word, you know, I'll turn around, I'll say, you know, do as I say to do, not as I do. and I guess, you know, the qualities that in terms of humility, it's hard to serve in government and not be humbled by the complexity of the problems that you're dealing with. But it's also when you serve in government, if you're me at least, you know, I really gravitated toward people who brought that kind of, it's not just humility of person, but it's to know that because these problems are so hard, to come in and say, you know, there's this right way, and why didn't we do it this way, or in the moment to be advocating it doing it this way without noting how much uncertainty there is on the front end of any choice that you're making. I mean, think of the polls in the recent election, right? I say something like this somewhere in the book in a different context, but you know, billions of dollars spent, pollsters, you know, telling us what's going to happen in our election, and despite all the defenses that we see of the polls, you know, getting so many states wrong by such a significant margin, and that's in our country, right? Where they're calling people in their own language and know the culture and have the history. And I mean, with foreign policy, just I feel like that humility, you know, you really need to bring that to the conversation, but you can't be paralyzed by it, by that sense of, you know, you still have to fundamentally chart a course forward and recommend, you know, a course of action to the president. And so I just, it's what I admired, you know, the people that I met in government that I most gravitated to, people like Jake Sullivan, who's a really important advisor to Vice President or to President-elect Biden, you know, are people who can be decisive, but they do so having really wrestled with all sides of a problem. And not only can they be decisive, they are decisive. They chart a course forward. They're leaders, but they're leaders who, you know, don't act like they've got it all figured out. They're still open to contrary viewpoints and so forth. And then on feminism, it was just, you know, gets to the question Paul asked at the beginning. I mean, just this weekend, when Kamala Harris was speaking, it was one of those things, it just snuck up on me, how much it would matter, you know, to me as a woman, but to me as a mother, to watch my daughter. Actually, you can, in my Instagram, I posted a picture of my daughter just like was watching, and then I looked over and I just saw my daughter just looking up, you know. And when Kamala Harris said, you know, we're gonna be rooting, talking to young girls, said we're gonna be rooting for you I'm the first, but I won't be the last. We're gonna be rooting for you every step of the way. My daughter actually, like unbidden, turned to me and said, "She's talking to me, mommy. She's talking to me." And so, you know, we don't know the ways that unconscious, I mean, some people know, have theories of how unconscious biases get created, but for little girls and little boys to be growing up and just seeing this strong, kick-ass woman in this really important job, you know, toggling from talking about pandemics to criminal justice to soon she'll be talking about China and the future of the multilateral system. I mean, the range that she will get to show, and she'll laugh and she'll dance and she'll be a great aunt, to her nieces. We don't know the impact that's going to have any more than, we'll never really know the impact that having Barack Obama as president and having a male, not only as an African-American, but as a feminist president who married his boss, whose mother was this trailblazer, who had these 2 daughters. We don't know what that's doing for how fathers think about their responsibilities or think about feminism. But it's just thrilling that glass ceiling, that single glass ceiling has been shattered, and it does just feel like a matter of time before it goes the next level.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Nick Phelan is the next student with a question.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. It's super enlightening. And I kind of wanted to go, oh, sorry. My name is Nick Valen. I'm a freshman in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm calling in from Boulder, Colorado. And so I kind of wanted to go back to what you're talking about building out the character, especially with part 1. Because one of the chapters that was really striking for me was the Tank Man one, where you're covering a baseball game and then all of a sudden you see 1989 Tiananmen Square protests, and it completely changes kind of how you approach school and kind of your whole outlook on what you want to do with your life. And so since at that point you were not too far off of an age from all of us watching, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about when you kind of realized that was a pivotal moment, and whether or not it was difficult to kind of make a switch from sports, which is something that you love and still love, over to human rights. And then if I can just tack on a last piece, kind of how you went back and approached writing about it later on when you wrote this book.
Great. So that is a rare, thank you for pointing to that scene. So this is, some of you may remember who were around back in 1989, all those years ago, but Tank Man being the man in Beijing who was just coming back clearly from the grocery store and had his 2 shopping bags when the Chinese government decided to crack down on protesters, and just confronted the tank and stood up staring at the tank. And what was really, it was so moving for anyone who saw it at the time. But for me, just that assertion of dignity. I likened it in the book to something that also made a great impression on me when I was younger, which was when Martin Luther King Jr. went to Memphis, it would be right before he was assassinated. He was there to show solidarity with the sanitation workers, and I have a poster of this up in my wall here in the house, but the sanitation workers were just holding signs that said, "I am a man," with am underlined, and that was sort of what came to mind. So it was this assertion of dignity, the kind of universality of that longing not to have a tank in your face, and just I was only 18, I guess, at the time, but just feeling also my own sense of privilege in for whatever, again, I'm an immigrant, but have dealt with none of the discrimination and prejudices that even Irish people a long time ago would have dealt with, or Muslims today, or Hispanic American. There's just so many ways in which I have always just known that I've sort of gotten the sort of lucky side of the break, and I felt that in that moment. I felt, wow, like I'm there. What you're saying to me about you now being my age then, I was saying, wow, I am the age of those, not of Tank Man, but of the student protesters who initiated this movement to try to liberalize China. And so that feeling that I had was not, oh my gosh, one day I'm going to be UN ambassador and I'm going to get to talk to 400 Georgetown students and community members about my memoir, about my, my reflex and my thought in that moment. And I want to make this clear because I think any misunderstanding of it could make some of you feel as if you're not where you need to be, that you don't have enough direction. And how could you possibly? I was 18 years old, watching events in China that I knew almost nothing about. And so my feeling in that moment was just, I want to learn more. I don't know enough, and I'm lucky. Those were my feelings really pretty much. And so the learning more though required giving up some of my completely fanatical, watching literally every NBA game, every sort of Big Ten, Big East, NCAA men's basketball game, every single Major League Baseball game. I mean, something had to give if I was going to be learning something about China. So it did, but what's interesting is that unlike a lot of things, as I was talking to Paul about earlier, where as you write it, you realize, wow, that was actually more important than I understood it to be at the time. That is the rare scene that if you had talked to me, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, at any point before I wrote the memoir, at any point before I entered government, I would have said that that was a turning point. Because what it meant was that I went back to campus and I was willing to feel dumb, which is a really hard thing to do, right? To just say, okay, I don't know enough. I feel lucky. I feel a surprising kinship with these people I've never met who live really far away, and feel for them. And I'm sad for them that they're in this predicament of being stymied in this way. The little voice in my head was like, someday I'd like to help. Someday I'd like to do something useful, may have been sort of the extent of it, but it was mainly more modest. It was just, let me go back to campus. Let me not be afraid, as I wrote about in the memoir, of like underlining the New York Times and like circling, leaders and dates. And it was almost like, it wasn't quite flashcards, but it was, I had so many gaps in my understanding. And so that first step was so important, which was just, let me be vulnerable, different kind of vulnerability. Let me be vulnerable and not be in a place where I can sound off and rattle off sports statistics, but be in a place where I know a lot less than many of my peers, and certainly than the people I'm privileged to be learning from. And that's okay. And because I want to grow and I want to learn. And so that's why that moment ends up being so pivotal, because once you get that, it's now called the growth mindset, of course, but once you get that spirit of, it's interesting to me, it's moving to me, then the journey has just begun, right? Then it's like, if you don't care about not being on top of it, then I at that moment, in a sense, a new world was opening up to me that has provided so much, nourishment really, and stimulation over such a long period of time. And so the impact would such as it is, came much later than I just need to learn and grow in order to even have any chance one day of being useful.
Thank you so much.
Do you have time for one more question? Someone who's been waiting to pose a question?
Of course.
All right, Terry Baker.
Hi, I'm Dr. Terry Baker from Mount Royal University in Calgary, Canada. I teach composition and English, and really I'm thrilled to be able to attend this chat that you're having online. I otherwise would obviously not be able to hear you and experience this. But because I teach English, I wanted to pose a question about what role you think prose fiction might play in raising awareness of atrocities and the responses to, or the lack of responses to, atrocities. Is it only biography, autobiography, and nonfiction that can accomplish this raising of awareness?
No, not at least from where I sit. One of the things I did when I was UN ambassador is I struck up a partnership with the Public Theater with Oscar Eustis, the amazingly creative visionary who runs the Public and who helped with Lin-Manuel Miranda, of course, produce Hamilton and so many other plays. And the partnership was one in which Oscar and I would brainstorm whenever he had a new show coming, about whether there was something in the show, and this is Oscar can speak for himself about how he saw the partnership, but for me it was, is there something in the show that can help me break through at a time of polarization? Because we've the domestic polarization, but bear in mind that the international system, has versions of that as well, right? Where the US and Russia are here on this issue or that issue, and where the hardest thing is for any person, but also any country, to open its mind and be open to to new ideas or new ways of doing things or new coalitions, and to put presuppositions to one side and so forth. And so for me, the arts, the question was, is there a way where these plays, if I bring ambassadors, my colleagues, to them, that can create a space for a kind of dialogue that the more positional negotiations that are the bread and butter of the UN, that those couldn't bring about. And so, for example, I brought the UN Security Council, all the ambassadors from the Security Council, to Hamilton. That's my most impressive thing I've said yet, because the fact that I could get 15 tickets to Hamilton was record setting at the time. But, for countries that are not, and now it sounds funny to say given what we're going through in our election here, but let's say who haven't been democratic for as long as us, or don't have well-established or long-established democratic institutions, to see the historical contingencies of our own American story, and especially the way race is played with, of course, in the casting, but also explicitly acknowledged in the writing. And so, less about the vehicle is this great yarn about this and its biography in a sense, and the great music and the dancing and this, but what the ambassadors are left with, many from countries that are not democratic or are newly democratic, is all of us are a work in progress. All of this that we see around us we can't think that it was inevitable, right? It's about a set of individuals making a set of choices and having these kinds of debates. And so that was an example of what that imparted. The other example that I'd offer, where the public put on the LGBT themed musical Fun Home. So there I brought a number of ambassadors. It was, I invited people pretty strategically, some who'd be very progressive in terms of their politics or themselves might be gay, but the Russian ambassador, a number of African ambassadors. I mean, these were ambassadors whose instructions from capitals on LGBT issues were very clear. They criminalize, in the case of a few of the African countries, being gay. And in some countries, there's the death penalty. And so I can't, in the General Assembly, move my African counterpart to change his country's position. He doesn't have that power, even if he wanted to. But in bringing these individuals to this play, and God love them for coming, all of them, right, should be commended for coming, because it's going to get back to their capital too that they're there. But what I could see their discomfort at the beginning, and then just as happens in life, right, is that you melt into the characters, and you're seeing, it's not about, are you gay or not gay, lesbian or this or that. You see the main character fighting her first crush, wanting it to go away. And any individual can imagine fighting their first crush on somebody they feel they shouldn't have a crush on, or wish they weren't having a crush. And so the universality of that story can break through in that space in a way that it just can't when it's, hey, join my resolution on UN officials having same benefits, the same benefits that their same-sex counterparts have. Like, once I'm in that conversation, I'm not going to be able to jog anything free or loose. And so I think everything I've said about theater and drama, where Michael Frayn said, I think about the wonderful thing about theater is, about each character is, every character is right from their standpoint, and like the best theater, the audience is brought into, a full and comprehensive perspective of a situated self, and that person thinks they're right, and then this person thinks they're right. And so as an audience, you're getting to be brought into the shoes of so many. So everything I've just said, I think, applies just as well to literature and even poetry, but literature, especially when you have the characters who, again, your defenses go down when you're in a plot, and when you're drawn into points of commonality, even if there are divergences and so forth. And so I think it's an incredibly important tool. I mean, my own life, we talked about Tank Man in that moment, but I don't know if I'd be doing what I did today if I hadn't read Night. Now, that's a memoir and not certainly not fiction, sadly, but To Kill a Mockingbird, and my original conceptions of justice and standing up for things and so forth, so framed by those books that you read at such a young age that can make that kind of impression. But I think that's a lifelong phenomenon.
So beautifully said, and so apposite to what I've been trying to do with my course, and I like to think what we're doing in Georgetown College and what we're doing in humanities education generally. So thank you for putting it so strongly and for really backing it up with your beautiful book. I can't wait to see what's next and watch you in government, knowing what I now know about what it takes. So thank you for that too. Thanks to everyone who joined, and a special thanks to Ambassador Samantha Power.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Our pleasure.